Despite his wretchedness and ill deeds, there's a lot to pity about the life of Gollum, how overwhelmingly corrupted he was by the One Ring, the horrible living conditions he endured, and his torture at the hands of Sauron, to name a few. But there's possibly another aspect to Gollum that is quite sad, one that is entirely separate from his deeds, and that is that he might be the very last of his people. In this episode of Middle-earth Mysteries, we talk about the disappearance of the Stoors, the River-Hobbits, and what might have happened to them. Around 1050 of the Third Age, the Hobbits first appear in the history books, a group of them known as the Harfoots, known for being the shortest of hobbits and those that mostly dug holes into hills, crossed the Misty Mountains and settled mostly in the Arnorian successor kingdom of Rhudaur, with some dwelling as far west as the Weather Hills. About 100 years later, they were joined by another group called the Fallowhides. They were taller than the Harfoots and were far more inquisitive and adventurous. And then there was the third group of hobbits, the Stoors. They were broadly built and were the only group of hobbits that grew beards, were generally friendlier to men, and most importantly, they built boats and they swam. Around the same time as the Fallowhides appeared, the Stoors also migrated into Eriador, but took the more southerly route over the Redhorn Pass. They dwelt apart from the other two groups of hobbits, dwelling in the Angle and near to Dunland, where they interacted with the Dunlendings and even picked up a few words from their language. In 1300, Angmar arose in the north of Eriador. The reappearance of evil caused the hobbits to begin migrating westwards in large numbers, first forming settlements around Bree, such as Staddle, and in 1601, the brothers Marco and Blanco eventually founded the Shire with King Argaleb II of Arthedain's permission. The Harfoots and Fallowhides settled there first, and in 1630, they were joined by the Stoors, who migrated north from Dunland. Over time, the three groups would become a mixed people and would collectively be known as the Hobbits or the Halflings of the Shire. But not all hobbits ended up in the Shire. In 1356, the date that would mark the beginning of the Angmar Wars, a group of Stoors decided that there was no future in Eriador, and instead of migrating westwards, they went back over the Misty Mountains to the Vales of Anduin. There, they settled near the Gladden Fields and seemingly lived a somewhat prosperous existence. And from this group came Smeagol, born around 2430. But as things would turn out, Smeagol would not spend his life amongst his brethren. In 2463, Smeagol murdered his cousin Deagle and took the One Ring. Using it as a tool for mischief, he was eventually expelled from the village by his own grandmother, and he went into exile. After that, we don't hear about the Stoors in the Vales of Anduin for centuries. There's absolutely no mention of them. That is until the Hunt for the Ring, which details the Nazgul's attempts at finding the Shire and the One Ring. On the 1st of July, the Witch King and 6 of his companions cross the Anduin, and by the 22nd of July, they meet Cumul and the other remaining Nazgul in the field of Celebrant. Cumul reports that he has already searched the Vales of Anduin and found no trace of any hobbits, except for long-abandoned villages near to the Gladden Fields. But the Witch King isn't about to write off the Vales of Anduin that quickly. He correctly guesses that the Shire is within the north, but he incorrectly guesses that it's near to or even within the bounds of Lothlorien. At the very least, he believes that if they cannot find the Shire, then they at least stand a chance at finding Gollum, who was last reported to be in the area. So all 9 of the Nazgul ride north and spend at least the next 6 weeks searching the Vales of Anduin. In September, they regather in the Wold, their search having been entirely fruitless. So what happened to the Stoors, the River Hobbits? Well, it's pretty much a certainty that the long-abandoned villages that Cumul found belonged to them, and probably even included Smeagol's old village. The long-abandoned line clearly indicates that the Stoors didn't just flee from the Nazgul or anything else fairly recently, and given that all 9 of the Nazgul then spent at least 6 weeks searching up and down the Vales of Anduin for the Shire, it seems like they didn't relocate nearby or possibly to anywhere else in the entire region. Then how do we explain this disappearance? Well, there's one hopeful answer and one sad but realistic answer. The hopeful answer is that the Stoors simply did relocate due to the rising danger in the region. The fact that the villages were described as abandoned, and not destroyed, lends some hope to this idea, but that alone isn't really concrete evidence. The question then becomes, where would they have went? It's possible that they stayed in the Vales of Anduin, and that their new settlement was hidden enough, or perhaps far north enough, that the Nazgul never came across it. Lord of the Rings Online actually plays around with this idea. In-game, there's a hidden hobbit settlement in a mountain valley to the north of where Beorn lives. I believe it's implied that the hobbits are being protected by the eagles, who also live nearby. It's also possible that the Stoors moved beyond the Vales of Anduin. They may have moved east or northeast, though this seems unlikely. They might have went westwards back over the Misty Mountains and returned to their older dwellings in the Angle or near to Dunland. They may have even migrated to the Shire. But the major issue with these answers is that we have no evidence for them. If the Stoors returned to the Angle, surely they would have been noticed by the Rangers who had their main settlements in the area. And it also seems likely that if there was a third migration to the Shire, that would have also been mentioned. The other answer is simple but far less hopeful, that being that the Stoors are dead. The grim reality is that between the Stoors last mentioned in 2463 and the War of the Ring, the Vales of Anduin were a rather dangerous place. Only 3 years before Smeagol took possession of the One Ring, Sauron returned to Dol Guldur, officially ending the 400-year-long watchful peace. From this point on, the forces of the enemy became far more active, and the Vales of Anduin were not spared. In fact, the Vales probably had it worse than many other places. 20 years after Smeagol was exiled, orcs began to carve out more strongholds in the Misty Mountains, and Sauron even sent some of his own servants to inhabit Moria. These orcs would raid down from the mountains towards both the east and west, and they would attack those who attempted to cross them, such as Celebrian, the wife of Elrond. 30 years after that, the Balkoff Easterlings started to raid up the Vales of Anduin or through Mirkwood, and they are said to have depopulated all of the lands south of the Gladden Fields. And of course, there was the evil of Dol Guldur just across the river, the home of the necromancer, Sauron in disguise. It wasn't until the end of the 28th century when the Vales of Anduin became safer, thanks to the orcs of the Misty Mountains being destroyed during the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. But even then, the threat was never truly gone. During The Hobbit, we learn that the orcs and wargs were still making plans to raid the villages of the men who dwelt in the Vales. The Battle of Five Armies brought the orcs to their knees again, and the rise of the Beornings gave some semblance of organisation to those men who dwelt in the Vales, but even during the War of the Ring, we learned that the orcs from the Misty Mountains were, again, raiding into the Vales. All of this is to say that the odds of survival were not in favour of the Stoors. They were probably small in number, and not particularly martial. Stoors were friendlier with men, so they may have had some allies in the region, but given the fact that the men of the Vales didn't exactly fare well themselves, I don't think the Stoors would have been insulated from any upheaval. No, I think the Stoors' best mechanism for survival would have been to stay hidden, but once discovered, they could have fallen victims to orcs or wargs from the Misty Mountains or Dol Guldur, or perhaps even to the Easterlings. Whether they were wiped out in one big invasion or fell victim to violence over the long years until they dwindled away to nothing, we don't know. Now, Tolkien did briefly dabble with the idea of the Stoors meeting a different fate. In a different, but largely unfinished and more inconsistent version of The Hunt for the Ring, Tolkien stated that the villages of the Stoors, while diminished, were not entirely deserted, and that when the Nazgul searched the area, the remaining Stoors were slain or driven away. While the attack by the Nazgul is obviously far from ideal, the Stoors in this version of the tale were at least able to survive until the War of the Ring. Although not without hardship, as the phrase "not entirely deserted" in regards to the Stoors' villages implies that they certainly weren't prospering. However, in 1959, which I believe was after The Hunt for the Ring was written, I can't find a date for that, Tolkien confirmed in a letter that the Stoors had either died out, with the exception of Smeagol, or had fled from the shadow of Dol Guldur, so none were to be found by the Nazgul. So, like I explained earlier, both outcomes are possible, and it ultimately comes down to what you choose to believe. Did the Stoors simply leave and find peace elsewhere, or did they meet a violent end? Personally, I'm more inclined to believe the latter, but this is a mystery, so if you want the happy ending, then you're free to believe it. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If this video sounds familiar to you, I actually did cover the Stoors in my Extinct Peoples video, but they only got 3 paragraphs, so I think this deserved a video of its own. It's certainly not the most mysterious mystery I've covered, but hey, I'm scraping the barrel for mysteries at this point. But this series is just too fun to abandon. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you want to see the stores, just go to your local shopping mall.